Okay, welcome everyone to the ASU Humanities Institute. My name is Curtis Austin. I am the Associate Director of the Institute. Today we're going to be discussing the topic, the challenges and opportunities of building tomorrow's museum. And I can tell you from personal experience, and some of that will come out in the discussion, that there are uncounted challenges and opportunities in doing something like this. But I won't be the one to lead it. We have with us Liz Covart, who is a historian of early America, and she does traditional scholarly history, as well as public history and digital humanities. Covart is also the founding director of the Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios at the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. And so, without further ado, Liz.
Well, thank you so much for having me, for coming in person and attending online. I'm really excited to be at ASU because you're doing so many innovative things, and we're now about to embark on a very innovative path at Colonial Williamsburg, which isn't something new for the foundation, but is something being reborn, as it were, in the digital space. So I thought I would kind of give you the lay of the land. I thought I'd talk about my first digital project, Ben Franklin's World, because that helped me get my job at Colonial Williamsburg. We'll tell you about the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, what we do well, which is doing in-person experiences very well. A little bit about the founding of the Innovation Studios and our ambitions for a virtual museum. And then we're going to go into our research, because I'm not just telling you what I think will happen or, what we know about our audience, but we've actually been spending a lot of time preparing for our audience and getting to know them. And one of the biggest takeaways, if you take it from this workshop, would be know your audience. Because no matter what kind of content, whether it's a book or something digital that you're building, if you know your audience, you're more likely to succeed in reaching those that you're trying to build the content for. And then challenges and also big opportunities in the virtual museum space where we tend to go. So my first digital project is called Ben Franklin's World. It's a podcast about early American history. I started producing it in 2014 after I researched podcasting for 18 months, like a good historian does. And I came to the podcast because I'd always found myself a little bit too public-facing to fit in solidly in academia, and then too academic to fit solidly in public history. But I was very fortunate. My parents inherited some money, so my brother and I were allowed to attend very good state schools for undergraduate. But because they were paying for not all of it, but a good chunk of it, I had to prove to them in 2001 that I could graduate on time from Penn State and get a viable career with a history degree. And so I know my parents, and we'd been to all these national parks, and I went to this career services center and found that I could be a National Park Service ranger. And we love the national parks in my family, so I got an internship at the Boston National Historical Park. I am from the Boston and New England area, so that worked out nice. And I got to work there during a special time. This led me to my interest in history communications specifically, although I couldn't have articulated that to you at the time. When I started working at the Boston National Historical Park, it was the year before David McCullough published John Adams. And so questions from visitors were like, how do I get to Hard Rock Cafe? And it's like, you don't even want to go to Cheers, a Boston staple, you want to go to Hard Rock? And then all the questions, it's not that people weren't interested, but we weren't getting as many history-related questions. And I was kind of annoyed that nobody wanted to stop off at Paul Revere's house or the Old South Meeting House, actual historic sites on our Freedom Trail. But the next summer I worked there, McCullough had published John Adams, and we went from kind of a few questions on history to where was Dr. Joseph Warren shot at the third assault of Battle of Bunker Hill? And you're like, okay, wow. These are getting really detailed, but they would tell you, I read this book, John Adams. And then the next summer it was, all my friends were reading John Adams, so I needed to read John Adams. So by the time I got to my fifth summer, people were still talking about it, and they would say, I hated history, but everyone on the darn planet was reading John Adams, and I needed to know more about it, and now I kind of like it. So it gave me my bug for public history and this idea of how we communicate history matters. And like I said, I couldn't have articulated it at the time, but I became very interested in this question of how do we communicate the past? How do we engage people with it? from the Park Service experience. So when I graduated with my PhD from a very traditional program in history in 2011, I did my grad work at UC Davis. I didn't know what I was going to do, and I'm very fortunate. There is privilege in my story. My partner, my spouse, Tim, has always had a good high-paying tech job. So basically, I got to experiment for 6 years on what I would do. And I thought I'd build a career as an independent scholar. And I thought I'd write lots of books and articles. I worked with Alan Taylor. And if you know him, he produces an award-winning book every 2 years. And I thought my goal was to write him under the table. Like, I would just produce more. I don't know what I was thinking, but I was young and ambitious then. But anyway, along the way, as I was working on turning my dissertation into a book, I discovered podcasting. I read about them in a book. I'm telling you, I'm a really good historian. And I fell in love with them. And I wasn't even listening to history podcasts per se, but I was listening about social media, marketing, the publication business, things that would help me establish a platform for which I could launch my career as an independent scholar. Even in 2011, it wasn't common for everyone to have a professional website or a blog, and there were blogs back then, a blog or an active social media account. It was still kind of in this mix of not entirely frowned upon, but not entirely accepted either by professional historians. But I got into that space and I did well. And as I was preparing to research and write all of these books and articles I wanted to do, finish my first book, I discovered podcasting, and then I started listening to history podcasts, and I couldn't find one I liked. They tended to be done by a bunch of white dudes who read a lot of books about history, and then they'd kind of summarize them for you and never cite who they read. And because I wasn't that far from comps, I'm like, I know exactly who you're reading, and like, why isn't this cited? And also, I disagree with your interpretation, and also it's boring to have you just tell me about history. I wanted something nerdier. I wanted to go into early America. I wanted to introduce people to historians, and I wanted to solve a problem I'd seen in the Park Service, which is people would say people weren't interested in history, but that wasn't my experience with the Park Service. People were inherently interested in history, but they didn't know where to find information that they were looking for, because you realize you can't just go into Barnes and Noble and find a book about the Battle of Bunker Hill or this specific, tea crisis or whatever happened in the Revolution, because Barnes and Noble is curated and publishers pay for bookshelf space a lot of the time, and a lot of the good stuff's coming out of university presses, and you just couldn't find it. So I started this podcast after I researched it. It's called Ben Franklin's World because I did my grad work in California. And I knew I was going to talk about the 18th century, but I knew I wanted this vast early America perspective. The idea that it's not just the British American colonial narrative of early America, but that you do have to know all sorts of histories about indigenous peoples and peoples from Africa and peoples from the Caribbean, and then many different European empires all intermingling together. I love early America. It's just so complicated. And that was kind of nitty-gritty stuff I wanted to get in the podcast. So I started Ben Franklin's World. It was completely a hobby. If you listen, the first episodes are still up there. I'll cringe if you tell me you listen to them, but it was a hobby, and I did the best I could, and I was incredibly nervous when I started. But I had 294 downloads my first month, and I was like, wow, if 294 people came to hear me talk, I'd be really excited about that. And then the number doubled on my third month, and then I hit the front page of New and Noteworthy, and there was another podcast that was released by Gimlet. I apologize because I'm now blanking on the name, but it was about their tech podcast that they released. It was their first show. And it was like that podcast and mine on the same page. My downloads went to about 60,000 downloads that month, and then they leveled off at about 30,000. So it was like, oh, now people are listening, and I have to treat it like a business and true historical work, and that's why I haven't written a book yet, is because this was an opportunity. I never expected it. It was just an outlet for public history, but I got a lot of luck in there and did things right. So Ben Franklin, it's named after him because he was a man of the 18th century. His lifespan, 1706 to 1790. He's also someone, if you don't know his name around the world, you know he was a man of the 18th century, which is our bread and butter. But he was very interested in everything and very curious. And so I figured if Ben Franklin was interested in so many things, there wasn't a topic about early American history I couldn't cover. And the periodization of the podcast has always been 1450 to 1820, 1830, thereabouts. And that's just because I wanted the freedom to start an Indigenous America when I needed to, and I wanted the freedom to kind of explain, show continuity with history. And I'm also a scholar of the Revolution, so it's hard not to get into some aspects of U.S. history, although I really do consider myself an early Americanist, it doesn't have a national history bent on it. Over the last 10 years, because we're that old already, we've won 2 national awards. We won the Best History Podcast Award in 2017 from the Academy of Podcasters, and then we won the DAR's first ever Franklin New Media Award a couple of years ago. And it also led me to win a Distinguished Alumni Award from my undergraduate alma mater, Penn State. So we've been doing a lot of good work with the podcast, and we have over 12 million downloads. And to put it in perspective, it would take the average podcast, which receives about 1,000 downloads per month, like 600 years to do the same thing that we did. So we're a top 3 or 4% show. I have had help along the way with this podcast. I work with the Omohundro Institute, which, if you're not familiar in early America, they are the Institute for Early America. They publish the journal in the field. It's a big scholarly deal. And when I was in 2013, my circuitous career, I ended up in the Harvard dissertation group because I was living back on the East Coast, and they invited me because one of my cohort mates from Davis was in the group. Laura Ulrich, Fran DeVal, and Taylor. This is how things work in the history field. I was working there, and the interesting thing about Harvard is they have money. I mean, everybody knows that. But what it meant was they could bring in speakers that, like, my state institution never could. And when they say brown bag lunch, believe me, I brought my brown bag lunch like we'd have at Davis. They mean catered. But what was really neat was they brought in Karen Wolf and Chris Grasso, who at the time were the book review and editor of the William and Mary Quarterly. And they did a whole talk about how you could write and publish essays in the leading journal of the field. And this was really great, although the advice I have to tell you in that period was still finish your dissertation, write an article later. I know that is very different from the advice given now. But during her talk about book reviews, Karen Wolf made a really strong case about how they were an important part of the business side of history, and it was our scholarly duty to participate in this system of peer review. And she explained the cycle of history is like the peer review, the book review was the end of the cycle. I disagree with her still to this day on that. I think the end of the cycle gets the word out to the public decides what ideas are valuable, and then that starts a scholarly process all over again. But she mentioned the business side of history, and it wasn't like this earth-shattering thing. I think I sat there in 2013, I was like, that's really interesting. And so in 2015, I'd been doing the podcast for a while, and it went from like telling people this is what a podcast is. They're like, sure, I'll be on your podcast. What's a podcast? And explaining how we get all the tech to work and things like that. I was blogging about my success because I wanted more people to do it. Like, this was proving a successful way to get scholarly ideas out to the world, and I wanted more people to do it. So I was blogging about my story, and then people started contacting me about how to get on the show. And I was just like, for one variety of reason or another, they're just not a good fit. Like, the project wasn't a good fit, or maybe they were just kind of a jerk in the profession. We try to be good academic actors there. But I had to tell them no, and I had no idea how to do that. And I'm a junior scholar, so like the idea of telling someone who's very senior in the field that like, no, you're just not a good fit for the show was just crazy to me. So I reached out to Karen Wolf, and I was like, you're going to go to the Society for Historians of the Early American Public Conference. I'm going to go, and I have some business side of history problems. Could I take you to lunch and pick your brain? And that started a relationship with the Omohundro Institute, where I prepared a whole presentation, color copies. I had it spiral bound on podcasting because the Institute wanted to learn more about podcasting, and they took me how they did book reviews, which they thought was the equivalent of this. She also taught me how to say no, which is not about the person, it's about the opportunity not being a good fit for you at that time. So it's never about saying no to the person, just the opportunity, in case you're curious there. So while at the Omohundro Institute, I really developed Ben Franklin's world into something more. So in 2016, we debuted this podcast within a podcast called Doing History. In 2016, we did 16 episodes, or no, it was 14 episodes that specifically talked about the process of history. How do historians come up with a topic? How do they research it in the archive? How do they handle material sources instead of print sources? What is this historiography, a word we don't really use in the show, but the history of history writing, what value is that? How do you conduct your research? How do you store your research? What do you do in the digital realm? So we had all sorts of episodes. We ended with Lonnie Bunch telling us about public history and the founding of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And then Karen's like, let's talk season 2. And I was like, you contracted me, you've paid me under what this is value, you can't afford to have me do this. She's like, we'll do the revolution. I'm like, oh, you're tugging on my heartstrings here. And we did. She offered me a job, which was how they got around. They couldn't afford me as a contractor. So I ended up working at William & Mary and this nonprofit institute there. I learned how to do narrative episode production while working for them. That started in 2020. But the greatest thing that also happened for me is there was a lot of debate at that time whether podcasts could be scholarly work. And I realized that, we talked to scholars about their work more so, our narrative episodes are more so like piecing together an original narrative. But by having the Omohundro Institute back it was formed of a legitimate piece of work, because we do a lot of intellectual labor behind the scenes, figuring out how the story is crafted, figuring out what kind of edits to make, guests to invite, how do we curate the field? There's a lot of labor that goes into that. And so once we started doing it, then a lot of other people got into podcasts. I will say Ben Franklin has been very prolific as a podfather. And that led me to the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. Colonial Williamsburg was originally a founding partner in the Omohundro Institute. William & Mary was the other partner. They had a falling out when the last president of Colonial Williamsburg had to right the financial ship, and he just made some stark cuts, including budgetary reasons, to the OI. So really, I have Colonial Williamsburg to thank for my OI job, because if you aren't aware of the business side of history, even these research institutes like the Humanities Institute, I think here, if you apply for federal or grant funding, part of that is making sure that the work that you do with that grant is getting it also out to the world. So the OI had some very prestigious postdocs in early American history, and they would report to the NEH, we get the work out into the world. Look, Colonial Williamsburg is one of our founding partners, and look at all the public history they do. When Colonial Williamsburg temporarily ended that relationship, the OI had to find another avenue of public history, and my podcast was primed to help them do that. So thanks to Colonial Williamsburg, I found employment at William & Mary. And then in 2022, Cliff Fleet, the president and CEO, who's trying to reassert Colonial Williamsburg as an educational institution, as a field leader in museums, he started recruiting me for my current job. And because they started sponsoring my podcast for the OI as a mea culpa, we're sorry we ended the relationship, and now we'd like to back in. So they're happily partnered again. They paid for the podcast. So just a little bit about the foundation. It was founded in 1926. We are going to celebrate our centenary the same year as the 250th or the semi-cinquentennial of the American Revolution in 2026, specifically the Declaration of Independence. Its mission has always been that the future may learn from the past. That's the reason to be at Colonial Williamsburg, is that we interpret the history of Colonial Williamsburg so that people can learn from the founding ideas of the founding government, a lot of which ideas came from Williamsburg. They can find lessons and life experiences of everyday people, most of whom that's most of what we interpret at the foundation. Not everything we do is first-person interpretation, but that was a methodology of interpretation that Colonial Williamsburg invented way back when. We are known as the museums of the museum because we preserve so much knowledge, and we have power on staff that when museums need something or they're looking for a model, they'll tend to look at us first. And there's only really one museum that's bigger than us in the United States, and that's the Smithsonian. So we're a very big institution of about 1,500 employees, 1,000 of which work on the nonprofit side, like myself. We have 89 original 18th century buildings, and we just moved the Bray School, quite famously, which was a school used by the Anglican Church to educate enslaved and free Black children in Williamsburg. It's not the comprehensive education you get today or think about, but it was education. So that's our 89th building. And then we preserved 20 skills and trades. So when I was explaining this morning, when Mount Vernon needed George Washington's harpsichord fixed, they sent it to Colonial Williamsburg to be fixed. So that's why we're known as the Museum of Museums. We do in-person history extremely well. So this picture slide is a spattering of just some of the things you can learn about. In the right-hand corner, at least it's on my right, you can see parts of our folk art museum. We have the largest American folk art museum in the United States. Below that is a recreation of the Capitol. That's oddly not the Capitol for the Revolutionary City, which is what we portray. We portray history between 1763 and 1783. That is the first Capitol building founded in 1699. So we talk about that when we have guests in. If you move next door, you'll see a building that is being preserved. You just see the building innards. That's the inside of the Bray School, and next to it is a historical picture of the Bray School. Above that, we have active archaeology going on in the foundation at all times. That was the First Baptist Church archaeology that happened. That's now since been covered up because we're getting ready to rebuild the structure for 2027 or 2028. I forgot which one that's coming out. But that's one of the oldest Black congregations in the U.S. So we're working with the descendant community, both on the Bray School and with First Baptist Church, to make sure that we have community input as we recreate these places. Above them, you will see a carpenter. He may be a cabinet maker too, doing his work. We preserve all sorts of wood crafts. And the Shields Tavern, because believe it or not, we try to cook recipes in the historic fashion, and they actually have plants. I was saying for an event, Chef Julie, our head chef, was telling us how there was a strain of wheat they used to eat in the colonial period, and it had kind of basically died out. But they were able to find some heirloom seeds, and our gardeners helped bring it back. And now it is milled in North Carolina, and within 3 days we get the milled grain back, so we can make some of our dishes. So we do a lot of sourcing in natural ways and preserving not just the physical and the history of things, but also food stuff and plants. One of our biggest experiences that people come to us for is for people like Kurt Smith, who looks like Thomas Jefferson. Our nation builders read all their papers, they read the books, they try to embody the founding fathers, and they're not just the founding fathers. I know Kurt is, but different people who are important to Colonial Williamsburg, and you can have a whole conversation with him like he's Thomas Jefferson, and he's very good, like he knows his stuff. And then below, we have a rare breeds program. So that is sheep 24-1, our first sheep born this year, our first baby lamb. That is a Leicester long-wool sheep, and we're helping repopulate that population, as well as Cleveland Bay horses and Red Devon oxen and a bunch of different fowl. But baby lamb season is very popular because baby lambs are cute. So those are just some of the things you can see at the foundation. We do all of this really great in-person work, and yet there are 332 million Americans. They're not all coming to Colonial Williamsburg. They're not all coming to interact with our past. And our future is that the future may learn from the past. So what can we do to tell people about the history of early America, help society think more historically, to help them become more engaged, active, civic-minded citizens, which is all work at Colonial Williamsburg. So we've decided we're building digital infrastructure, and the thing I'd like to talk to you about is the piece of digital infrastructure I've been tasked with, which is building the virtual museum. So we are going to build the world's largest virtual museum about early American history. That's what it may be in my lifetime. At some point, I do see them covering all of U.S. history, and even because of the way we'll lay the foundation with vast early America, world history going forward. So they intend to become not just a U.S. leader in this space, but an international leader in this space. And what we're going to do is complement our in-person experiences by creating the digital. And some people, that will be the only way they interact with us, but other people, they'll be like, I'm so impressed with what you did online, I need to come down to Tidewater, Virginia, and experience the in-person experience as well. So we have large plans for the virtual museum. We're actually well poised to build one of these things. So Colonial Williamsburg has a long history of developing award-winning media. Before my department existed, it lasted till 2017. There was this department called Productions, Publications, and Learning Ventures. Around town, it's PPLV. And they used to build these electronic field trips for which they built these experiences and they broadcast them on television. So the PPLV department in Colonial Williamsburg won 14 regional Emmy Awards and a Japan Prize for their work in building these historical experiences. It wasn't quite digital, it was broadcast television, but we have this idea of content. They also did, they also built a virtual version of Williamsburg. It kind of looks like a video game, but when I was telling you about the Capitol, that's the original Capitol replica, not the one that they actually, Richard Henry Lee's resolution to declare independence was decided in. They built a virtual Williamsburg so you could see the changes in the building and the architecture. And I guess there were some statues, I apologize, I think it's Lord Botetourt, but I'm not 100% sure, former governor that was in the entryway. That doesn't exist there anymore. So they were able to recreate what didn't exist in this place. But they were about 15 years ahead of their time. And that did get cut in 2017 because of financial needs of the foundation. But now we're given birth to the Innovation Studios. So it was founded last year on January 3rd. That was also my first day of work. And our mission is to create and build engaging digital content and experiences so that the future may learn from the past. If people can't come to Tidewater, Virginia, we're going to bring Tidewater, Virginia, and all of vast early America to them. And so we're going to be able to extend the reach of the foundation and its work. How are we going to do this? Audience matters. I told you if you take one thing away, audience matters. Get to know the audience you're writing for, the audience you're serving, the audience you want to reach. Do a little research. Don't just get to know like their ages and demographic information. Get to know the psychographic information as well. What makes them tick? What are they interested in? Create an avatar of your ideal listener or reader or watcher or whatever. And that'll help you make decisions that will build successful content to your audience. So Colonial Williamsburg, we've been obsessed with this audience question for the last couple of years. Before I got to the foundation, they conducted a nationwide brand research survey with this company called Brand Federation. And I'd like to share some results of that. And then I'll share this will be our first public unveiling of our digital audience research that we'll be using to help inform the museum. So this was the methodology behind the brand survey. They did both a quantitative and a qualitative study. They tried to be pretty even with races and genders. The thing that gets me is they only interviewed people 35 and up. You will see that didn't suit our purposes for digital, so our methodology is a bit different. You will understand that Colonial Williamsburg, the East Coast, is our bread and butter. We love the revolution, friends. And people on the East Coast love it too, but we also know we're a national brand, an international brand, and we wanted to gauge how familiar people were and what they thought of us across the country. So we tried to make sure that we weren't just emailing survey people in our area. And then we did qualitative study with some virtual communities to get to know them better as well.
Could you say really quickly how you define the East Coast? I mean, is it Maine to Florida, just those seaboard states, or something else?
That's a great question, and I don't know because I didn't do the study. They always say Eastern Seaboard. So yes, but I know that we also have reach in parts of like the eastern-facing Midwest.
Right, that's why I spent a lot of time in Columbus, which is on the East Coast, but when you look at a map, it doesn't look like that. Yeah.
But yeah, that's a great question. I'm sorry I don't have the answer, but I'll try and get one for you. So this is kind of what they did, is they asked them questions and asked people to agree with it. So what we found is history has become a hot button issue, and I'm just going to read my notes to take you through our research. So they said, sometimes the debate around American history makes me feel frustrated and angry. And so people were asked to say how much, like, yes, they agreed with it, or no, they did not agree. And they did this with political party affiliation because, there's a lot of divisiveness, so they wanted to find out how much of people's thoughts of history were also branded in their political identities. So 70% of Republicans and Democrats say yes to this answer. Leans Republican, leans Democrat, scored a little bit lower, and then of course we have independents. Some people are tuning out, we also found from history. So this was way we measured that. Sometimes I stop listening, watching, or talking about American history out of frustration or fatigue. Do you strongly agree or disagree about this? 54% of Republicans said they agreed. 64% of Democrats said they agreed. So you can see a little bit more of a breakdown along political lines there, but it's still actually pretty relatively even. We also found that there is a shared belief in telling the complete story, and this was different for us in terms of the numbers performed a little bit differently than one might think based on media reports today. When we asked them the question, the most important role of history is to tell the complete truth about the past, 93% of people who leaned Democrat said yes, 92% who leaned Republican said yes. 90% of Democrats said yes, 87% of independents said yes, and then 86% of Republicans. There's also the shared belief that in history's evolving and expanding stories. So we gauge that by asking them, do you agree or disagree with when new information becomes available, that is an acceptable reason for our understanding of history to change? And as you can see there, 80% of leaning Democrats said yes, 75% of Democrats and leaning Republicans said yes, 74% of independents said yes, and then 64% of Republicans said yes. So this is kind of the gauge. It tells you, yes, there's some depressing news about history, but overall, people are very interested in it, and they do believe that history can change and evolve when you find new information, that it's not just something that is static. And you know, there is a belief out there in the country that that's how that happens. So, and here's just some more stats. I apologize. I copied my colleague's slide on this, so I'm just going to go through because I did not intend the animation. People are curious about history. So how important is it that your experience with American history evoke the following feelings? And as you can see, 83% of people said it should make me curious. 80% of people said it should make me feel inspired. And then you can go down the list where 26% at the bottom said angry. So there is an interest in history and people want to be curious about it. We also really found that people want to know how we know what we know. They found that the sticking point of that is people don't want to be told what to think about evidence once presented in front of them, but they want to know what the evidence is, where that evidence came from, and then they want to form their own ideas about it. So that shapes our interpretation. That also, by the way, shapes the government, the National Park Service's interpretation. Everybody is a taxpayer. We know that going in, and you don't tell people what to think. You just give them a bunch of questions and interpretive programs that are designed to evoke thought and let them think what they will about it. Our brand study was really good, but from a digital point of view, it didn't answer things for us because we know that the digital audience tends to skew a bit younger. So we approached Edison Research, who is a company that has a lot of experience doing digital studies. They do the big podcast survey every year, and there's actually now several big podcast surveys. There's a Share of the Ear report, but there's also the Latino podcaster report and the Black podcaster report as well. So they had a lot of different data that we could use that made them appealing partners for this. We also worked with Brand Federation rather. So if we were asking overlapping questions, they were worded the exact same way through this new survey audience. You can see that this survey was a bit bigger. We did 3,051 people versus like the 2,400 they did with the other study. We also went younger. So we asked people ages 13 and up what they thought about this. We conducted it last August, and then they weighted the study based on US population statistics. So they tried again to make sure we had a diverse and a representative audience that we have in the US to gauge our study. We did have 3 objectives. We wanted to measure the target audience for digital content focused on early America. We also wanted to understand the demographic and psychographic characteristics of current and potential audiences for digital content. And we also wanted to know what media and platforms and content we should create that people would watch and interact with. Some of the results won't be that surprising. Digital video is king. It tends to score highest among younger populations, but even boomers, like late boomers, they have a very strong interest in video. The difference was it's like 90 percentage points worth of younger people, and it's like 70 percentage points for older people. And then millennials and Gen X and stuff are in between. A majority of Americans 13 plus, they have an interest in early America. Good news for us, but they're not always aware of Colonial Williamsburg, which was bad news for us. But opportunity, right? An opportunity for us to introduce early American history and the Colonial Williamsburg brand to new audiences and get them involved. We found that they're most likely to consume digital media about early America. That audience, it tends to be college-educated men and under the age of 45. And I'll show you some of the specific audiences they gave us because they revealed 3 different audience types. And I have those slides. And then again, video content really appeals to people, but people aren't necessarily interested in the life of Thomas Jefferson and your George Washington. They want to know how everyday people like themselves were living and represented. And that's a lot of the questions we get. So that kind of fit in with our experience at Colonial Williamsburg as well. This is what we know about their digital access. 96% have internet access and 91% have a smartphone. That's in the US. I know that with Latino populations in South America, data is a big issue right now. We have a much cheaper access to cell phone data for them to download podcasts and digital content than they have in South America. But the numbers of people engaging with it are going up. We know that 57% are interested in US history specifically, 54% in early American history. That's an opportunity. We can turn more heads, get them involved in early America when we show them that it's not just the colonial British American narrative, and showing others that, that narrative does exist. 72% use at least one digital source to learn about historical people, places, and time periods. So people are already trying to find information about history through digital means. So we'll just be expanding the means they can find that. And 63% of early American enthusiasts are interested in learning about everyday life. Again, just taking home that people want to know the daily stories of people. So if you haven't picked your dissertation topics, think about it. And here's just some summary results. Those who are interested in exploring history and digital media, they do tend to skew younger. This presents a big opportunity for us because we can get people interested in history at younger ages. And the other interesting thing to consider about is, as you know, they call that the demographic cliff, or the point where white Americans will become a minority. We know that the younger audiences are just more diverse, and that's what they were finding in their study. So that presents opportunities for different and more histories, inclusive histories, to be told. And then the result of this was they aggregated our results and they presented us these 3 audiences. So one is the high-tech history enthusiast. I'm just going to go to my notes here because I wrote down some summary things and then lost. So they tend to be 60% men versus 40% women. They do tend to be, closer to that, teenage and 20s years. They use social media a lot. I don't know if that's completely true because I know that there's some issues with Gen Z not wanting to be like their parents and use the social media of them. So marketing firms are using like Discord chat rooms and other places where they're at to try and market to them, which is exactly what they don't want, but that's what they're doing. But they won't come to your museum until they've interacted with you digitally, is what we are finding, is they do their research online. They tend to use YouTube the most of different media channels. So again, just emphasizing video is king, not audio podcasts, but it's okay. And they are very interested in early American period. So this audience represents history lovers who are very comfortable with digital technology. They have an interest in historic sites, and paired with their frequent use of technology, this makes them an ideal segment for us to build digital content for. This next group, I think, is our biggest opportunity. These are the tech-savvy history dabblers. So these are people who have kind of a passing interest in history, but they're not what you would call a history enthusiast. They're not history nerds like you and I. They tend to skew male, but less so 55% men, 44% women. They tend to be younger and more middle-aged than the previous demographic. They're also on YouTube and social media in big numbers, and they're just an audience that consumes history casually, but when they do consume it, it's primarily through media and entertainment. They are most interested in the everyday lives of people rather than past military or political figures. And this segment is, again, a little bit on the younger end, but they're not that young. They tend to work full time, and they most likely consider their political ideology as moderate. What makes these a big audience for us to go after is that there was something in our survey that said, they would consume history, podcasts, and digital content. That's how they'd like to learn histories, through those digital means, but they don't actually do it. So there's a question of why aren't they actually doing it, but it seems that there's nothing been built yet that is compelling enough to get them to watch or consume the media. So I look at that as a challenge accepted. We will create some sort of content for them, again, by really thinking hard about our audience, doing some listening tours as we're doing with our revolutionary hybrid podcast series, where we're talking to people. Like, if we do look at the American Revolution from west to east, what would attract you to that program? Like, what would get you excited about the American Revolution and looking at U.S. history, the origins of it in this way? The last audience are the low-tech history enthusiasts. These are people with a strong interest in history, but they're not so tech savvy. We will build content for these people, but maybe not specifically for these people. We will be gauging our content. We've been told to go after younger millennials and older Gen Z with our video content. That's what we're experimenting with right now. But it doesn't mean we're not getting people watching it that are older, and YouTube, of course, tells us that. So we are starting to grow the younger audience that we want, and also taking care of some of the needs of our older audience, which Colonial Williamsburg probably thinks of its tried and true audience, because these are the people who donate money year after year after year. How are we going to get these younger audiences? We're experimenting a lot with our digital video team right now. We're trying to tell stories of everyday people living everyday lives. So I gave an example this morning where we're doing short videos on people we don't know a lot about, but we know existed, just to point out these are everyday people, and we tell them what we know, and we also try to tell them what we don't know about their lives. We're also experimenting with animations. Animations are big with people. So we have this one, our magazine wall, that's where the gunpowder plot, you'll hear a lot about it next year, happened during the Revolution. And when they originally reconstructed that building in the 1920s or 1930s rather, they built it with 10-foot high walls. Well, they found historical evidence to basically said the sources we were using were reported from a child. So this wall would look like 10 foot tall to a child. So they went and dug around, and they found it would have been more like 5.5, 6 feet tall. So we've been reducing the height of our wall, and it's been happening. So we had a video to prepare. We have a very interested and engaged fan base, and we didn't want them to be caught unaware when they came in and saw the magazine wall over. So we have a video with text, captions that come in, and animations of the wall going down with some construction dust. And people are watching it. We're also, we borrowed this from Smithsonian. They have some really engaging Instagram content on Smithsonian, and it's just captions and music. And that really appeals to people like me who are watching TV, what I mean really scrolling on Instagram on my phone. So I'm not gonna have the volume off, but I'm still being able to learn something through the captions. So we're running different tests and collecting some of that data to see what works and what doesn't work. And so a lot of that's going to be experimenting as well as listening. And we'll probably conduct more surveys in the future as well. So what does this all mean for the virtual museum? Well, I want to upend the idea of the digital exhibit, which I think we have all experienced, where in most cases it's, here is my beautiful exhibit that I have in my museum. Let me take pictures, and we'll post those pictures up online, and maybe some of the text from the cards, and you can experience us that way. That is not engaging. That's going to result in a high churn rate of people leaving your site. We want to be able to create engaging digital experiences. So some sort of experience where maybe you can pick up the object you can't touch in our actual room and turn it around, and maybe go through some, choose your own adventure stories about the different object that happens in the room. We are going to create by playing to CW's strength. Again, we do the in-person with historical interpretation so well and helping people situate themselves in revolutionary America. We're going to take some of those lessons and see how we can adapt them to digital means. I also think there's definitely room for AI. We're starting to experiment that, at least I'm having my team experiment with that, like how can we use this in our workflow, because it's all about the prompt. And if you can get good with prompting, especially with the large language models, you can, we'll be prepared for the future. But I think with AI, we're going to have to be an organization that not just creates user-end tools in the museum, but one of those infrastructure companies that builds the data. We have a lot of data at our museum. We have a strengths in early American material objects. We could put our data into an AI model as the infrastructure, and then you could go in and you say, I'm really interested in, I'll give you an example of really interesting ones, chamber pots. Archaeologists have found a lot of them, and some of them have the seal of the king, which I thought was really interesting. Like, that's a political statement, right? But it wasn't the political statement I thought they were making. The archaeologists explained that no, like George Regis would appear on the seal because they were showing their patriotism. And I'm like, but in a chamber pot? In the Revolution, I think you can look at it a different way, but you could go through and just have your whole experience be about pottery and chamber pots and ceramics, and the AI can help you do that. If you were interested in horses, again, you could go through our data on historic breeds and the research we've done there, and you could have an experience at Virtual Museum that's all about horses. I know that there will have to be some limits on that because there's certain experiences we won't want people trying to recreate, like things that play into white supremacy and things like that, but we'll want to learn. So I don't know what the parameters are, but I see, as much as I see the opportunity, believe me, I also am thinking of pitfalls in places we don't necessarily want to go. We're probably going to have gameplay in there. I'm doing a lot of some reading now on gameplay and how gamification can make experience like people want to learn. You have that here, the Alien Zoo with Dreamscape Learn. They found that kids that would normally fail the biology class are actually passing because they're so invested in saving the baby giraffe alien. We want to be able to do that for history as well. And I think we have an easier time because we're about humans. It's a humanistic experience, so I think we'll be able to help. We're also going to expand our geographic and temporal boundaries. So as I mentioned, Colonial Williamsburg, your in-person experience will be what we call the Revolutionary City from 1763 to 1783. That's so all the period clothing looks the same. It's so that when you go into different shops, they're talking about the same period, even if it's different ways. And maybe one 1763 and the end of the 7 Years' War here, and the start of the Revolution in another site. But you're getting a more or less coherent narrative. We'll be able to expand the boundaries. So we could have digital exhibits about early Arizona and the different indigenous peoples that came here, maybe some of the Spanish colonialism that happened here. I don't know, the sky's the limit. Environmental histories, we could do that. And you wouldn't think of that fitting within Colonial Williamsburg, but it also helps contextualize Colonial Williamsburg in ways. So we're excited about that. So these are just ideas. We are in the very early stages of thinking and planning. I've had 2 meetings with my colleagues across the foundation about this, but I have built a team that has experience in public history, and specifically curation and museum creation, as well as your tried and true scholarly academics, and then your curators and all our specialties involved. We have a team, and in May, we're really going to start planning that out. This also prevents us with big challenges. Our CEO, Cliff Fleet, wants us to create a legacy digital project. That's a project that outlives you. There isn't a lot of examples of digital legacy projects, so we have to really think about things right. Things that keep me up at night are tech stack. I don't know how it all works. I just know it's not working as good as it needs to work, and we need to have a strong foundation. We're going to have to partner with companies like a Google or an Amazon that have the tech resources, so when the software changes, not only can they help us get the foundation tech right, but our experiences can be adaptable as much as possible before we might have to sunset them. It also means we're going to have to produce a lot of content to keep the museum going and fresh and exciting for people. That means big bucks. We don't like to I won't say it here because I think you do talk about money, but on other places, so historians don't like to talk about money. But this stuff costs money. And we're going to have to think about how we go about through donor support, grants. We want to make Cliff Fleet's dream is to even make our in-person experience free, for people. So we want historical information to be out there as freely available because we do want to help make good citizens of the world and get people civically engaged. We also have a challenge in, quite frankly, convincing people that museums can be digital. Even in our own staff and our in-person staff, there's a fear that what we're going to create is going to cause them to be without a job. And I just look at them and it's not true. We're going to complement and expand what they can do. You can only get so much in a 5 or 15-minute interpretive talk. We could give you so much more about the site you visited or the context that you learned at Colonial Williamsburg through a digital experience. And we're also going to need help with expertise. We cannot be experts in all areas of early American history to start with. So we're going to have to partner with other institutions and other organizations who are maybe doing digital work or have cool projects that we can make digital to help reach other people. So we'll be doing a lot of amplifying work, but really bringing in solid partners who can help us, or maybe already even have something that's compelling that people will want to look at. There are also big benefits. Quite selfishly, we will expand Colonial Williamsburg's reach and its work, help society think more historically and be more civically engaged. We're going to create new history enthusiasts, which is just good for society and the historical profession, because there'll be more opportunities for museums that exist or new museums to form. If people just had a greater appreciation of history, they knew more about it, and then they knew the work that all historical professionals do in that work. We're also going to increase the work of our mission, which will be good. I guess that's kind of a duplicated point, but it didn't seem like it yesterday when I was working on that. And we may also increase visitation. So I don't know if you remember, but I remember in the early 2000s when some of the art museums started putting their collections up online, and they're like, what are you doing? This is going to be bad. Nobody will ever go to your museum. And then people who experienced it digitally had to come in person to see it. And I think not everybody's going to be able to make it to Tidewater, Virginia. Quite frankly, we're a little hard to travel to from many areas. But if we can engage people, maybe they don't go to our museum, but they go to their local historical society or their local museum. And maybe they do come to Colonial Williamsburg. So I think it's just going to increase visitation and interest in history for so many more sites. So there are big challenges and benefits. Those are just kind of the highlights. I know that there are many others. I thank you for hearing me out. And I realize I talked most of the time. I didn't plan that, but the data was very exciting. But if we do have some questions, I'd be happy to take them. Or if you have ideas and thoughts, I'd love to hear them because this is still really early stages for us.
Thank you very much. We do have time for a couple of questions. If anybody wants to get started, that'd be okay.
I'm just going to grab a pen. Yeah.
Okay. So actually, I'm reflecting on one of the things you said, plus one of the statistics I saw, was where 12% of folks were black, right, who were interested in this. And before that, you said there was going to be, so you're going to listen to the community, right? And I'm wondering, one, is there like a commitment to actually listen, or is this just, I don't know, lip service? And I'll tell you why I'm asking. I'm asking because you did work at the National Park, for the National Park Service. And I was in Natchez once. This is 20 years ago, so this was 2004. It's 2024 now. I'm there in one of these big mansions, right? Natchez is in South Mississippi. And, you know, the person who's, the tour guide is telling us all about this wonderful mansion in Natchez. And one of the things he said was, oh, and the enslaved people who lived in this house were really happy. They were quite happy to be, you know, here. You know, I thought that was questionable. So I asked the question, and it did not go well from there. I'm actually going somewhere with this question. Anyway, it went so poorly that when I got back to work, I was working at Jackson State University at the time, and the building I was working in was the Margaret Walker Alexander National Research Center. I know that's a mouthful, but it was the first building on campus, built in 1870, and then the National Park Service gave Jackson State $20 million to refurbish it. So Monday I got back to work, and my boss called me, and this is the National Park Service called, and wanted us to tell you that if you can find enslaved people who were in fact not happy, then they'll include that in the story.
Oh my God.
I know, right? And so that's the last thing you need to tell me. So that's what I went and did. I found a bunch of unhappy enslaved people who were there, and they changed the story. So I'm just wondering if you're actually going to listen. And then here's the other piece of the question. Like, I have consulted for places like the World War II Museum in New Orleans, the new Mississippi History Museum, Civil Rights and the History Museum in Mississippi. And not just me, but a lot of experts, a lot of faculty get called in to be consultants on this thing. And we worked for years, and they paid us really well. And then the museum opens, and nothing we say, makes it into the museum. And so my question is, like, is there like a real commitment to listen to your consultants, your experts, the folks from the community, to make this a viable, more accurate kind of presentation to the public?
Yes, I mean, there's commitment on my end as a scholar and as the director of person going to be in charge of building this, but there's also commitment on the foundation. And while we're just new, getting our feet wet in the digital space, my department is basically a small, scrappy startup in a very mature organization, which has its challenges and benefits. But I think you can see with our interactions with the First Baptist descendant community, the Bray School descendant community, how we partnered with William and Mary and the Bray School Lab on that. You will see us, Indigenous communities as well. We have Indigenous outreach, and we have a lot to work. We haven't always done these things correctly in the past, but we're committed to doing them now. And our CEO is very committed to it, and the board is committed to it. So while it may seem ad hoc, no, we're really listening. And if I don't know something, I mean, this is how I started a podcast, right? I just ask. I was saying at lunch, I was the person in grad school, if I didn't know, I would just ask the question everybody was thinking about, but was too afraid to ask for fear of looking stupid, and I would rather just know. So I don't fear asking the questions. And I built a team that is dedicated to this as well. So we'll be using best practices, and we don't have all the expertise. So we are going to have to reach out and ask people and take their advice. And I agree. I also anticipate sometimes we're not going to like what they have to hear, or that we may disagree with it, and we're going to have to find compromise. But that's what I like about historical work in the public space. At least we have to be collaborative, and we have to work together because we do provide a service. And we want to make sure that we're serving people the best that we can be and the best service that they would like us to be providing. So,
Absolutely, absolutely. And of course, Colonial Williamsburg wouldn't be what it is without the folks who made it really profitable. All those, I don't know how many years it's been, but over a century.
Yeah.
It makes sense to share that with the world.
But yeah, it's an important point. But yes, we're really listening to people.
This is related, but different and related. I'm interested in the question of aesthetics and presentation. The reason I'm saying that is because you can have some podcasts, for example, where just the way it comes off, even though it's rich in content, the way it comes off, I'm not going to listen to it. And there are others where I'm like, that's really engaging. Maybe it's because they're having a conversation rather than one person. Maybe it's the level of conversation, like it's too academic, or the pace of it is too slow, or it's way too fast. So I don't know if there's a Goldilocks in there, but so I'm interested in this problem of how you figure aesthetically, what are people looking for? I know people's, the we is a broad term. So how do you navigate the aesthetic question?
It's a really great question. You know, I'm thinking of all the ways in my podcast that we've done that because it's a 10-year-old project and we've had to think. If you'll listen to my podcast, it's not super conversational, and that's because when I started podcasting, nobody would do Skype with me. They just were like, I'm not going to be on. Do you know how many bad job interviews I've seen on Skype? So I used Google Voice phone calls, digital calls from my computer, and I couldn't see the person, and I didn't want to interrupt. And I was so nervous to interview people, and I got better at it, but I didn't want to interrupt people. And then I got listener feedback. They're like, I love that you don't interrupt and not talk over your guests. And so I kept that because I got audience feedback that what started as a nervous tick, they actually really liked. And I've also found too, you know, my job is not to be, I'm an expert in a lot of things, but, you know, because of the nature of the work, I become a really expert generalist on early America, but it's not my role to be the expert, and you have to be comfortable by asking the right questions to let your guests shine, and that shows your expertise. The audience thinks you're smarter by doing it. But we control pacing. I spent a lot of time in marching band growing up. I was in the Penn State Blue Band in undergrad, and just music, concert band, and thinking about the value of silence and the rest and the pace of a conversation. And we've all had guests, right? You make a really important point and that was really great, and then you just keep going and you miss the point. We have to add a pause, like you've made a really important point, and you gotta let that point sit with people for a bit. So some of it is, this is the creative part of doing it. It's an art rather than a science. Others of it is we're gonna listen to our audience and experiment, and if the feedback's good, we'll continue to do it, and the feedback's not good, we're going to be like, okay, that's not a failure. We just learned the ways that this is not going to work, and try something else. I will say that one of our biggest problems is, even as a museum, you need to have an audience. And Colonial Williamsburg is a museum that wants to speak to everyone. And there is a saying, if you try to speak to everyone, you will speak to no one. So we are having this conversation and kind of tension right now in my division about audience, because it's so important. We're tasked with going after a younger demographic with our social media videos and content like that. But we're revamping our website, and they also need help from my digital media team to create content for the website. And we are an organization that tries to work smarter, not harder. But the director of marketing is telling me that the videos we create for that younger demographic on YouTube are not going to play well on the website. So, you know, we're going to have to adjust our weekly release schedule to accommodate the fact that we also need to be creating digital content that'll play well for the website. But we're having these conversations, and I think by knowing your audience and knowing some of those psychographic details, it makes the creative license you can take with the aesthetics and putting together the right mix of aesthetics a little easier to do.
Perhaps one more?
I was interested in how open are you to serving areas of research that you haven't listed here? More that are also early American, but you don't seem to have here. Or how flexible are you in moving into those other areas as well?
Our mandate is to be as historically accurate as possible. We know that scholarship is something that evolves and changes because we find new evidence. Also, it's up to each generation to interpret the past for themselves. So that question about are you a revisionist? And it's like all history is revision, because every generation can ask themselves the same questions and come up with different answers. Because no matter how objective we try, as you know, we're just colored by our present. So I am open to other interdisciplinary subjects. We're very interdisciplinary as an institution. So that, I mean, maybe if you saw like it was history centric, that's just my take because I'm presenting it as a historian. But you know, I think even in the media that we produce on the podcast and others, you will see that we do interview people from English. We interviewed Tara Bynum quite recently, and you know, my only complaint was she has great observations, but as a historian, I wanted more detail. But she made us think of ways that we would not have thought just as plain historians, and I think those viewpoints are valuable and can add. So yeah, I think we're very open to that as well.
Thank you.
Okay, we want to thank everybody for coming here in person and to our friends online. And would you join us in giving us a really healthy Sun Devil? Thank you to Liz Covart.
Thank you.